In this video, I'll show you how I create game-ready foliage using a high to low poly baking workflow. We'll model flowers, leaves, and grass, texture them in Substance Painter, and bake them into optimized cards you can use in your scenes. It's a simple technique that gives great results, so let's jump right in. I'll start by modeling the flower petals, and for that, I'll begin with a simple plane. I'll create a rough petal shape and add a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it out. I'll add a few edge loops to better control the subdivision. Before adding thickness to the petal, I'll shape it first. This makes the mesh easier to manipulate. Next, I'll extrude the mesh to add some thickness to the petal. Once I'm happy with the final shape, I'll apply the subdivision surface modifier. I want the mesh to have plenty of geometry since I'll be using sculpting to slightly break the surface and avoid that too perfect look. Feel free to add as much geometry as needed, as these models will only be used for baking later on. Once I'm done refining the shape, I'll duplicate the petal as a backup and start forming the first flower. I'll duplicate the first flower and scale the petals slightly to create a variation. I'll keep using the same petal model, but reshape it into leaves this time. I'll start with proportional editing, then switch to sculpting for easier refinement. I'll take one of the leaves and start shaping it into grass blades. I'll create a few variations of the same blade. Using the same method, I made an ivy leaf. I'll skip showing that part and move on to assembling the ivy. I'll start by adding a Bezier curve. In the curve properties under the bevel options, you can set a depth value to give the curve some thickness. I'll move the points around to create a natural-looking ivy branch. You can use the Alt+S shortcut to adjust the thickness of individual points, creating a tapered look for the branch. After refining the ivy branch, I'll convert the curve to a mesh and repeat the process to create a small bush branch.
Roger, 0J, and I feel fine. Discovery Houston, press to ATO.
Liftoff of mission 41D, the first flight of the orbit Discovery, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Once I'm done with the branches, I'll start adding leaves to them. Using the top view makes the assembly easier, and afterward, you can adjust the leaf heights to give the ivy a more natural-looking flow.
Discovery, go and throttle up. Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
I'll join all the leaves to the ivy branch and repeat the process with the bush branch. I'll also group the grass blades into a few small grass patches. Now that the basic foliage is done, I'll start preparing the meshes for texturing. To make things easier, I'll assign materials based on the color of each foliage type. Since these meshes will only be used to bake the necessary information later, I don't need a clean UV unwrap. I'll just use Smart UV Project. After unwrapping, I'll export the models and bring them into Substance Painter. After importing the models, I'll quickly bake the mesh maps and use my stylized base material to start texturing. I won't go into detail about how I made this material, but if you're interested, you can download it along with all the project files, including the Substance Painter files, using the link in the description. And if you'd like a more in-depth look at how I create stylized materials and textures, make sure to subscribe. In my next video, I'll cover exactly that. Once I'm done with the texturing, I'll import the textures into Blender and assign them to their corresponding materials. Now it's time to bake the foliage texture maps. For this part, I'll slow down the footage and walk you through it step by step. I'll move the high poly meshes to the side and add a plane to the scene. I've scaled the plane to give myself more room to work with, and then applied the scale. I created a new material for the plane and switched to the shader view to make the workflow easier. Now I'll add an image texture node and click the New button to create a new texture. Let's give it a useful name and choose the size. I'll go with a 2K texture, but that's just a random choice for this tutorial. Make sure to leave the alpha channel enabled. We'll need it later. Now I'll connect the texture to the base color input of the material. The plane will turn black, which is the default color of the new texture. Now I'll start laying out the high poly textured foliage meshes on top of the plane. The exact order doesn't matter. Just make sure there's enough space around each piece and no intersections between them. Also ensure the models sit slightly above the plane, but not too far. Now that the models are laid out on the plane, it's time to bake them into texture maps for our foliage. First, make sure you're using the Cycles render engine. Then head over to the Bake tab. Let me quickly open up the UV editor. This is where we'll be able to preview the baked images once they're done. I'll select all the models one by one while holding Shift, and make sure to select the plane last. I'll explain why in just a moment. As you can see, the plane has a yellow outline, while the other models have orange outlines. This means that within the selection, the orange ones are simply selected, while the yellow one is the active object. For the bake type, I'll choose Diffuse, since I'm baking the base color texture first. I'll deselect all light contributions, as I only want the color information. Then, I'll set the baking method to Selected to Active. This means that all the selected objects, the ones outlined in orange, will be baked onto the active object, which is outlined in yellow. Now I'll hit Bake and see what we get. The baking is done, and as you can see, we only got a partial result. That's because we didn't adjust any of the baking parameters to define how the bake should behave. Luckily, this isn't a complex bake, so just a few settings will do the trick. First, I'll adjust the extrusion value. The extrusion setting, when using Selected to Active mode, controls how far the rays are cast from the active mesh toward the selected mesh during the bake. As you can see, we got a full bake this time. But there's still a slight issue. There's a thin outline around all of our foliage pieces, and this could become a problem later when adjusting the UVs. We can fix this by changing the margin setting in the bake options. The margin determines how many pixels the bake should extend beyond the edges of the UV islands. Since we don't need this extra padding right now, let's set the margin to 0. And there you have it, a nice clean bake. I'll now save this image as the base color texture and repeat the process for the normal, roughness, and ambient occlusion maps. Okay, now that the texture maps are baked, it's time to create our actual foliage models. I'll start by adding a plane and assigning a new material to it. Then, I'll import the baked textures into this material. Make sure to connect the alpha output from the base color texture to the alpha input of the principled BSDF shader. The alpha channel acts as a mask, determining which pixels should be visible and which should be transparent. Here you can see our texture maps in action. The normal map, in particular, does a great job of faking depth, even though this is just a flat plane. And now comes the tedious part. I'll duplicate the plane several times and start sliding the edges around to shape the mesh based on the foliage. You don't have to be super precise, just focus on capturing the basic silhouettes and giving the mesh a bit of depth so it doesn't look completely flat. I did this in 2 passes. First, I slid the edges to block out the general shapes, and then I gave the mesh more character by displacing parts of it slightly. I'll skip the boring part and just leave you with a few notes. Don't go overboard with the face count. This method is meant to improve your render times, and especially if you're making game-ready foliage, you'll be duplicating these meshes a lot. It's better to play it safe. Also, when displacing the mesh, always consider the natural flow of the foliage. Don't move things around randomly, make sure each displacement has a purpose. After finishing the individual pieces, I move on to creating full grass patches and bushes. Alright, here's the library scene I made for a video a while back, just without the foliage. I'll append the foliage I created and start scattering it around the scene. You could use a particle system or geometry nodes for this, but since it's a small scene, I'll just place everything manually. Just a quick reminder, if you're interested in checking out the final result, you can grab the project files for free on my Gumroad page. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video where I'll show you how I make my stylized textures. That's it from me for now. See you in the next one. Bye.